15 men, 15 minutes, £2.5 million. It was the crime of the century, and they nearly got away with it. In the dead of night on August 8, 1963, a gang of criminals pulled off the most audacious heist Britain had ever seen. They stopped a Royal Mail train, overwhelmed the crew, and vanished into the darkness with more money than most people could spend in 100 lifetimes. The police were stunned, the public was captivated, and for a brief, glorious moment, the robbers thought they'd outsmarted everyone. But here's the thing about perfect crimes: they're never actually perfect, and the mistake that brought this entire operation crashing down, it wasn't a witness, it wasn't a confession, it was something so ordinary, so laughably simple, that you won't believe it when you hear it. A single moment of carelessness that cost them everything. If you're fascinated by how the smallest details can unravel the biggest schemes, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. This is the tale of Britain's greatest robbery and the fatal error that destroyed it all. The Great Train Robbery didn't happen on impulse. This was months of meticulous, obsessive planning by some of the most experienced criminals in London's underworld. At the center of it all was Bruce Reynolds, a charismatic antiques dealer with expensive taste and a gift for organizing men who lived outside the law. Reynolds assembled a crew of specialists. There was Buster Edwards, a club owner with nerves of steel; Charlie Wilson, a bookmaker who knew how to move money; Gordon Goody, a hairdresser with a reputation for violence when needed; and then there was Ronnie Biggs, a small-time crook who would later become the most famous of them all, despite playing one of the smallest roles in the actual robbery. But the real genius of the plan came from someone the gang never publicly identified. He was known only as the Ulsterman, and he worked inside the post office. This mysterious insider fed the gang crucial information about which trains carried the largest cash shipments. He told them exactly when the money moved, which routes it took, and how it was guarded. Without him, there would have been no robbery at all. To this day, his true identity has never been confirmed. The target was the overnight mail train traveling from Glasgow to London. Every week, this train carried enormous sums of cash from Scottish banks heading south. The gang learned that on the night of August 7th, the train would be carrying an especially large shipment because of a bank holiday weekend. The timing couldn't have been better. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would stop the train at an isolated signal gantry near a place called Sears Crossing in Buckinghamshire. To do this, they covered the green signal light with a glove and rigged a portable battery to make the red light glow. The train driver, Jack Mills, would see red and stop, thinking there was danger ahead, and that's exactly what happened. At around 3 a.m. on August 8th, the train slowed to a halt in the middle of nowhere. Within seconds, the gang swarmed the locomotive. They uncoupled the front two carriages, which contained the high-value packages, from the rest of the train. Then they forced Mills to drive the shortened train further down the track to Bridego Railway Bridge, where a waiting lorry and army of hands were ready to unload. The entire operation took roughly 15 minutes. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the robbers had disappeared into the English countryside with 120 mail bags stuffed with cash. The final count came to £2,600,000. In today's money, that's somewhere around 60 million. It was flawless. It was brilliant, and the gang had a safe house waiting just 27 miles away, where they planned to lie low until the heat died down. They thought they had everything figured out, but that's where the story gets darker.
The safe house was called Leatherslade Farm, a secluded property in Buckinghamshire countryside. The gang had purchased it weeks before the robbery through an intermediary, specifically because of its isolation. No neighbors for miles, plenty of outbuildings to hide vehicles, and most importantly, enough space for 15 men to stay hidden while half the police forces in England searched for them. The plan was simple. They would stay at the farm for several weeks, dividing up the money and waiting for the massive manhunt to calm down. Once the initial frenzy passed, they would slip away one by one, disappearing into new lives with their share of the fortune. But almost immediately, things started to go wrong. First, there was the problem of the train driver. Jack Mills had been struck on the head during the robbery when he tried to resist. The injury was more serious than the gang had anticipated, and news of the violence against him turned public opinion. What might have been seen as a daring Robin Hood-style caper now looked like something uglier. The police were under enormous pressure to catch the men responsible, and they weren't going to stop until they did. Second, the gang got restless. Staying cooped up in a farmhouse with 14 other criminals and bags of cash everywhere isn't as glamorous as it sounds. Tensions rose, arguments broke out. Some of the men wanted to leave earlier than planned. The discipline that had made the robbery so successful started to crumble. And then came the critical mistake. The original plan called for the gang to thoroughly clean the farmhouse and burn it to the ground before leaving. This would destroy any evidence of their presence. But as the days passed and paranoia grew, the gang made a fateful decision. They paid a local man to come and destroy the farm after they left, rather than doing it themselves. They handed him a small portion of the stolen money and assumed the job would get done. It didn't. Meanwhile, a local herdsman named John Maris had noticed something strange. There had been unusual activity at the farm that had sat empty for months. Vehicles coming and going at odd hours, lights on at night. He mentioned his suspicions to the police, who initially dismissed the tip. But as the days passed and the investigation stalled, detectives decided to check it out. On August 13th, just 5 days after the robbery, police officers drove up to Leatherslade Farm and found it abandoned. The gang had cleared out, but what they left behind would seal their fate. The police were about to walk into a crime scene the robbers had gift-wrapped for them. When the detectives stepped inside Leatherslade Farm, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. For men who had executed one of the most sophisticated robberies in history, the gang had been breathtakingly careless about covering their tracks. The farmhouse was a forensic goldmine. Everywhere investigators looked, they found evidence. Sleeping bags, personal clothing, food wrappers, empty bottles, and surfaces absolutely covered in fingerprints. It was as though the gang had made no effort whatsoever to clean up after themselves. And in a sense, they hadn't. They had trusted someone else to burn the place down, and that person had simply taken the money and vanished. But the most damning discovery was almost comical. The police found a Monopoly board set up on a table. Nothing unusual about that, except when detectives looked closer, they realized the gang had been playing with real money. Actual stolen banknotes mixed in with the play money. The game was still there, abandoned mid-session, with fingerprints all over the pieces. Then there was the ketchup bottle, a simple glass bottle of HP sauce sitting on the kitchen table, covered in greasy fingerprints. It seems like such a mundane detail, but that bottle and others like it provided investigators with clear, identifiable prints from multiple gang members. Within days, Scotland Yard had matched prints to known criminals in their files. Roger Caudry, Charlie Wilson, Tommy Risby, Roy James. One by one the names emerged. The irony was almost painful. These were men sophisticated enough to plan a heist that baffled investigators. They had manipulated railway signals, coordinated a 15-man operation, and escaped with millions. But they couldn't be bothered to wipe down a sauce bottle before they left. There were other mistakes too. Some of the men had brought personal items to the farm, clothing with laundry marks that could be traced back to them. Others had left behind vehicles with registration numbers that led straight to their associates. It was as if, having pulled off the impossible, they simply couldn't imagine getting caught. The forensic evidence from Leatherslade Farm gave police everything they needed. Arrest warrants went out across the country, and within weeks the net was closing in. One by one, the robbers fell.
The arrests came quickly once police knew who they were looking for. Roger Caudry was the first to fall, caught in Bournemouth just days after the farm was discovered, with over £140,000 in cash stuffed into bags. Charlie Wilson was arrested at his home in London. Buster Edwards tried to flee to Mexico, but eventually returned and turned himself in years later. The dominoes toppled one after another. The trials, held in early 1964, were a sensation. The public couldn't get enough of the story. Here were ordinary working-class men who had dared to challenge the establishment and nearly won. But the judge, Justice Edmund Davies, was in no mood for leniency. He handed down sentences that shocked even hardened legal observers. 30 years for the ringleaders, 25 years for others. These were punishment levels typically reserved for violent murderers, not thieves. The severity of the sentences sparked debate that continues to this day. Was justice served, or was the establishment making an example of men who had embarrassed them? Many argued that the punishment far exceeded the crime. After all, no one had been deliberately harmed. But others pointed to Jack Mills, the train driver who had been struck during the robbery. Mills never fully recovered from his injuries. He suffered from headaches for the rest of his life and returned to work, but he was never the same man. When he passed away in 1970, many blamed the trauma of that night, even though the official cause was leukemia. Then there was Ronnie Biggs, who became the most famous train robber, despite being one of the least important. Biggs had been brought in late to the planning because the gang needed someone who could drive the train if their hired expert couldn't manage it. As it turned out, neither Biggs nor the expert could operate the newer model locomotive, and driver Jack Mills had to be forced to do it himself. Biggs received 30 years like the others. But in 1965, Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison after serving just 15 months. He fled to Australia, then to Brazil, where he lived openly for decades. He couldn't be extradited because he had fathered a child with a Brazilian woman. Biggs became a celebrity, selling T-shirts, appearing in advertisements, and taunting British authorities from afar. His escape infuriated some and delighted others. He represented the idea that you could beat the system if you were clever enough. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, managed to evade capture for 5 years, living in Mexico and Canada, before finally being arrested in 1968. He served 10 years and later wrote books about his experiences. Gordon Goody fled to Spain and was never convicted, though he later admitted his involvement. Others scattered across the globe, some caught, some never facing trial. But even with most of the gang behind bars, the questions never stopped. Here's what doesn't add up. The police recovered roughly £400,000 of the stolen money. That sounds like a lot until you remember that the total haul was £2.5 million. Where did the rest of it go? Over £2 million simply vanished, and to this day, no one knows for certain what happened to it. Some believe the money was laundered through criminal networks and spent long ago. Others think portions of it are still hidden somewhere, buried or stashed by gang members who died before they could retrieve it. A few conspiracy theorists have suggested that corrupt police officers skimmed some of the recovered cash for themselves, though there's no solid evidence of this. The mystery of the missing millions has never been solved. And then there's the Ulsterman, the inside man who made the whole robbery possible. He was never identified, never arrested, never tried. Some investigators believe he was a postal worker named Patrick McKenna, but this was never proven. Others think the Ulsterman was actually multiple people, a network of informants rather than a single source. Whoever he was, he walked away clean. He took his payment and disappeared into history, the only member of the conspiracy who truly got away with it. There are also questions about whether everyone involved was actually caught. The gang was large, and the planning was complex. Could there have been others who played supporting roles and were never identified? Some researchers believe at least 2 or 3 minor conspirators escaped justice entirely, their involvement known only to the robbers who kept their mouths shut. The romanticization of the Great Train Robbers has always been controversial. Films have been made about them, books written, documentaries produced. Bruce Reynolds and Ronnie Biggs became something like folk heroes, celebrated for their audacity and charm. But this narrative conveniently forgets Jack Mills, the working man just doing his job, who suffered for the rest of his life because of what happened that night. It forgets the postal workers terrorized during the robbery. It forgets that these weren't lovable rogues. They were criminals who used violence when it suited them. Modern forensic experts have speculated about what might have been different if the robbery happened today. DNA analysis, facial recognition, mobile phone tracking. The robbers would likely have been caught within hours, not weeks. The technology that we take for granted now would have made their careful planning worthless. They were lucky to commit their crime in an era when a fingerprint on a ketchup bottle was cutting-edge detective work. The Great Train Robbery remains one of the most audacious crimes in British history. 15 men who thought they could outsmart an entire nation, and for a few brief days they did. They pulled off a heist so daring that it captured the world's imagination. They had the money, they had the plan, they had everything except the discipline to see it through. In the end, it wasn't brilliant detective work that brought them down. It wasn't an informant or a confession. It was human arrogance, the belief that someone else would handle the cleanup, the assumption that details didn't matter once the hard part was done. A ketchup bottle they couldn't be bothered to wipe, a Monopoly game they played with stolen cash, laundry marks on their clothing, the most sophisticated robbery of its era, undone by the most basic forensic evidence imaginable. And yet, the story isn't really over, is it? Over £2 million still missing, the Ulsterman still unidentified, questions about who else might have been involved that were never answered. The Great Train Robbery has been studied, analyzed, and debated for over 60 years, and we still don't have the complete picture. Maybe that's what makes it so fascinating. Not the money, or the daring, or the famous escapes, but the gaps, the things we'll never know. The possibility that somewhere out there, someone connected to that night lived out their life in quiet comfort, never facing any consequences at all. Sometimes the smallest mistake echoes the loudest, but sometimes, if you're lucky enough, you don't make any mistakes at all, and you vanish completely.